the Europeans would trade guns and steel too for native goods, such as sarsaparilla, tortoise shells, and furs. The colony would be a short-lived one as Spanish would take over Providencia in 1641. Nevertheless, this didn't mean the end of the English-Bahuica relationship, as the Providencia colonies would migrate to the Bahuica country and settle among the natives, eventually integrating into the local population. Among the Providencia settlers who escaped to Bahuican lands, there were some African slaves, brought to the mainland by their masters as a follow. These people would follow the path of their masters and eventually integrate into the English society. At the same time, another group of African origins made their way into Bahuican lands, runaway slaves, many of which escaped from Spanish settlements near the Sabal, although a sizable portion of those North African arrivals seem to have come from stranded slave ships, which ended up in Bahuica territory. Both groups eventually also mixed into the native population. The cultural and biological admixture between the Bahuica and these new arrivals from the Caribbean would transform the natives into a completely new ethnic group, the Mosquito, and over the following decades, these people would undergo a drastic process of reorganization and cultural transformation that would lead to the rise of a new nation, the Mosquito Kingdom.
To get started in data analytics, you don't need previous experience or a degree. The Google Data Analytics Certificate will teach you to code in R, to code in SQL, data visualization, and learning how to problem solve like an analyst would. At the end of the day, being a data analyst is about communication. It's the number one soft skill that you'll pick up. And so learning how to take the information and make
Around 1640, shortly after their contact with the English, a mysterious historical figure emerged among the natives of the Mosquito Coast, a chief by the name of Old Man. Old Man seems to have been a powerful native chief that managed to extend his rule over all the Mosquito between 1640 and 1680, therefore making him the actual founder of the Mosquito state. Nevertheless, the historical record about him is fuzzy, and some authors even argue that there were actually two chiefs called Old Man in the early Mosquito history. Regardless of the discrepancies about his identity, most authors agree that a chief under the name of Old Man laid the basis for a unified Mosquito kingdom, and that said leader was, quote-unquote, a pure native, a more or less traditional indigenous leader. But that would change after the death of the legendary chief and the rise of a new leader, a man called Jeremy. According to most sources, he was Old Man's son, and he was of mixed African descent, a Sambu Mosquito. He would become the first king of the Mosquito Coast and would be crowned as such by Christopher Monk, governor of the English colony of Jamaica in 1687. This event is essential to understand the historical evolution and role of the Mosquito Kingdom in Central American and Caribbean history, as it would mark the beginning of a formal link between the English and the Mosquito as military and commercial partners. Although, it should be said, this partnership was not between equals, as the fact that the Mosquito kings were crowned by an English governor made them vassals to the King of England, something the Mosquito accepted as part of what they saw as a lucrative trade-off in which the English gained a foothold right in the middle of the Spanish Main, as well as a military ally in the region, while the Mosquito gained access to European military technology and markets for their own products. The Mosquito Coast became a trade hub that linked the English and later British Caribbean with the Spanish Captaincy General of Guatemala, serving as a route to circumvent the Spanish trade limitations. This trade was extremely lucrative, and by 1750 it moved between 40,000 and 60,000 pounds worth of goods. Soon after the trade was established, the Mosquito kings began to look for more profitable goods to sell, and eventually their efforts would lead to the establishment of the Mosquito slave trade, which linked the Mosquito kingdom with British and Dutch colonies like Jamaica and Curaçao, where European traders would sell the slaves captured by the Mosquito. The The mosquito would attack Spanish and indigenous settlements all over Central America, from the Bay of Amaquique in present-day Guatemala to the Bocas del Toro archipelago in present-day Panama. The mosquito would capture free people of color, mestizos, and some European settlers from the Spanish settlements. Drama, peg, and bribri. Sometimes the mosquito would ask for ransom for the Spanish captives, but the rest would be either enslaved by the mosquito themselves or sold to the British and the Dutch. Those enslaved by the mosquito into their society. This helped the mosquito nation to grow in number and power over the centuries, which helped it subjugate other native groups, which were forced to pay tribute to the mosquito in order to avoid further slave raids. Even the Spanish settlements began to pay a yearly tribute known as the Regalo al Rey Mosco. As the mosquito consolidated their power, their society became reorganized. By 1760, the mosquito kingdom had become organized in 4 districts, one ruled directly by the king, and the other 3 ruled by officials appointed by the British superintendent, the only British official in the kingdom. Said districts would be divided along racial lines, with the 2 northern districts, including the one ruled by the king himself, being home to the Sambu mosquito, and the 2 southern ones being home to the Tawira mosquito. The Sambu mosquito were those with African ancestry, and the Tawira were those without it. The Sambu were politically dominant, as the king himself was always a Sambu since the rise of King Jeremy. But the Tawira enjoyed a great deal of autonomy within the kingdom, especially after the creation of the second Tawira district around 1727. Also, it should be said, the Sambu mosquito rejected saying name and instead called themselves Mosquito Ainwa, which means true mosquito. Between independence and protectorate. For more than 100 years, the Mosquito Kingdom was a vassal state of the English and later British crown. The governor of Jamaica crowned their kings, and the British superintendent named officials that ruled its districts. Although, even with this deep British involvement in the kingdom's affairs, the Mosquito enjoyed a great deal of political and economic autonomy. But things were about to change, as in 1787 the British evacuated the Mosquito Coast and allowed the kingdom to fall into Spain's political orbit. The Spaniards tried to use this opportunity to finally enforce their rule over the region, but given the technical difficulties of sending an army against the Mosquito, they decided to act diplomatically and tried to use missionary activity as a way to assert their influence over the kingdom. The contacts between the kingdom and the Spanish authorities remained friendly for some years, until 1791, when the Mosquito King, George II, decided to assert direct control over the entire kingdom, unifying it politically and purging the pro-Spanish officials within Mosquito territory. This also meant the expulsion of the Spanish missionaries and the end of the Spanish attempt to integrate the Mosquito Coast, or Mosquitia in Spanish, into the Spanish realms. Despite lacking any real control over the region, Spain would claim the Mosquito Coast as theirs until 1821, when the Spanish control over the captaincy of Guatemala ended as it became independent. The captaincy joined Mexico in 1822, and in 1823 it became independent again, and the United Provinces of Central America were established. This nation would rename itself as the Federal Republic of Central America in 1824. So between 1821 and 1844, the Mosquito Kingdom enjoyed a period of de facto independence, as the Spaniards were gone, and the British had no direct say on the kingdom's internal affairs, as they used to do before 1787. Now, even though the political connection with the British was over, the Mosquito didn't stop trading with Jamaica, and the kingdom remained integrated within the Anglo-Caribbean trade network. Although its traditional connection with Jamaica soon became overshadowed by the development of a strong economic and political link with another British colony, Belize. also known as British Honduras. The connection between the kingdom and British Honduras would be so intense that, according to contemporary observers, the Miskito considered themselves symbolical subjects of the superintendent of British Honduras, something that became evident in 1816 when King George Frederick I was crowned in Belize instead of Jamaica. During the next decades, King George and his successor, Robert Charles Frederick, would give foreigners huge land grants in their domains, as well as exclusive trading rights to British merchants. This with the aim of bringing new investments and settlers to the kingdom. But this policy would not be as successful as the Mosquito Kings wanted. A very important change took place between 1841 and 1842, when slavery was finally abolished in the Mosquito domains, starting with the slaves of the Corn Islands, a small insular part of the kingdom. Other major changes that affected the kingdom were in relation to its geopolitical situation, as the kingdom became the center of numerous land and border disputes in the region. Between 1838 and 1840, the Federal Republic of Central America collapsed, and the Mosquito Coast began to be claimed by the new republics of Honduras and Nicaragua, which based their claims in the old Spanish ones. Meanwhile, further south, the Republic of New Granada had invaded Costa Rica and taken over the Bocas del Toro region in 1836. This was part of a plan to enforce their claims to the lands along the Caribbean coast, from Darien to the Gracias a Dios Cape, including the whole Mosquito Coast. It was in the middle of this dire geopolitical situation, and after years of negotiations between the British settlers and the Mosquito King, that the British protectorate over the Mosquito Coast was reestablished in 1844. This helped the British traders to secure their privileges and gave the Mosquito Kings a strong backup against the Honduran, Nicaraguan, and Grenadine ambitions over their territory. After the reestablishment of the protectorate, new European settlers arrived to the kingdom, including non-British settlers, mainly Prussians. Also, Christian missionaries returned to the Mosquito Coast, although this time they wouldn't be Catholic priests, but Moravian missionaries who began to preach in the country in 1847. The fall of the kingdom and the Caribbean frontier. The renewal of the British protectorate over the Mosquito Kingdom also obeyed a strategic interest over the Nicaraguan coast and the nearby isthmus of Rivas, which were already considered as a prime location for an interoceanic canal, and this didn't go unnoticed by a growing regional power, the United States. For years, the US had followed a very concrete policy towards Central America, rooted on the Monroe Doctrine, which claimed the region as exclusive influence area of the United States, and the growing British influence in the region was against the hegemony. After years of diplomatic tensions, both the United States and Britain signed the Clayton-Baltimore Treaty in 1850, in which both countries agreed to not colonize Central America, although an exception was made for British Honduras. Nevertheless, the British didn't want to leave the Mosquito Coast, and this led to a decade of British-American tensions over the subject. Such tensions sometimes escalated to actual violence, like during the American bombardment of Greytown in 1853. So, in order to both hold their part of the deal with the United States and keep some presence in the Mosquito Coast, the British decided to make deals with two countries with an even stronger interest in the region, Nicaragua and Honduras. First, in 1859, Great Britain and Honduras signed the White Cruz Treaty, in which the British allowed Honduras to take over any Mosquito lands they deemed part of the Honduran Republic, in exchange of financial support for the population of said territory for the next 10 years. In said treaty, Britain also returned the Bay Islands to Honduras. Later, in 1860, Nicaragua and Great Britain signed the White Celedon Treaty, which basically put the Mosquito Nation under Nicaraguan sovereignty, making the local rulers no longer a king, but a chief, although the Mosquito would retain the right to self-government. Through this last provision, the British intended to keep informal control over the Mosquito Coast, now renamed as Mosquito Reserve, or Reserva Mosquitia in Spanish. Acting as counselors to the Mosquito chief, The British would help to draft a constitution for the reserve, which basically granted English-speaking landowners control of the local government, and this situation didn't go unnoticed by Nicaragua, arguing that the reserve wasn't actually ruled by natives but by foreigners. The Nicaraguan government began to push for a greater control over the reserve's affairs. This led under Austrian arbitration in 1881. The Austrian resolution stated that while Nicaragua had a rightful claim to the region, the Mosquito were free to choose how to organize their government. Fled to Jamaica with some British settlers and supporters. In November of that same year, Cabezas assembled a Congress of Mosquito delegates and forced them to sign a declaration agreeing with the Decree of Incorporation to Nicaragua, which was based on the rules established in the White Celadon Treaty of 1860. This situation was deemed inadmissible by the British, and in 1895, the British Britain unified the Nicaragua. Once the separation was reorganized as the Department of Celaya, and the Nicaraguan government began to implement policies in order to start the Nicaraguanization of the state, which included the establishment of schools to teach the children Spanish and Nicaraguan law, as well as public colleges, the religion, and the also, the new government began to sell concessions to spread the religious soldiers and even ecclesiastical. After the establishment of the current Honduras-Nicaragua border, the Mosquito found themselves in a completely new political and economic situation. Their country was now divided between two different nations, and any semblance of self-government was gone. Under this new situation, the Mosquito would join the history of Honduras and Nicaragua in the 20th century, and be part of their odyssey as both countries faced dictatorships, foreign interventions, revolutions, natural disasters, and all kinds of historical events, which actually deserve their own video. Ever since Honduras and Nicaragua annexed their lands, the Mosquito have had tense and complex relationships with both Managua and Tegucigalpa, as both governments have attempted to enforce their own nation projects upon the Mosquito, while the latter have resisted with attempts through lawsuits, civil disobedience, and sometimes armed conflict. In 1987, after 6 years of conflict with the Nicaraguan government, the Mosquito won autonomy within Nicaragua with the establishment of two autonomous regions on the Caribbean coast. And since 2010, the Honduran Mosquito have obtained numerous titles over their traditional lands in the Ecclesiastical department. Besides the conflicts with the Honduran and Nicaraguan governments, the Mosquito today also have to face a myriad of issues, from the overexploitation of their forests and fisheries by foreign companies to the presence of international criminal organizations, all of which threaten the livelihood and well-being of the Mosquito today. Nevertheless, while facing these problems, unlike in previous centuries, the Mosquito in the 21st century are fighting and adapting themselves to the challenges of a new era. And today, about 200,000 Mosquito live in both Nicaragua and Honduras, with a sizable diaspora living in nearby Costa Rica. What does the future have in store for the Mosquito? No one knows. But what's sure is that they are going to keep on fighting and finding their way through adversity. After all, the kingdom may be gone, but the Mosquito Nation isn't, and their story is far from over.
Before we start, this episode was made possible by my patrons who voted and selected this topic. Everybody say thank you now. If you'd like to support the show and occasionally vote on special topics, you can do so on Patreon. Thank you for your support. Be sure to stick around at the end of the episode for some announcements. Few people in the pre-colonial history of Mexico are as well known and celebrated as Nezahualcóyotl. He was a ruler who remained near and dear in the memory of his people long after his death. So much so that his legacy survived the Spanish conquest and even thrived. But even to call Nezahualcóyotl by his proper title, Tlatoani, doesn't begin to do this man justice. He wasn't just a revered Tlatoanian ruler of the city of Texcoco, but a warrior, a charismatic leader, an artist, an architect, and a philosopher who remade Texcoco as a city of splendor. Today, we're going to explore this towering figure of Mexican history. Grab a drink and a snack, it's gonna be a long. It's impossible to talk about Nezahualcóyotl's life and accomplishments without talking about the contemporary politics of the Valley of Mexico. In 1400 CE, the valley was under the firm rule of the Tepanec Empire and its wily ruler Tetzalcoatl. In 1939, Matthew Sterling had just arrived in Veracruz, Mexico for a new season of excavations at the site of Tres Zapotes. Sterling was searching for answers about a relatively recently identified civilization in Mexico, Olmec. Tres Zapotes had already been identified as an Olmec site, but at the time, not much was known about Olmec civilization. There was only a delicate consensus about who the Olmec were. Most scholars assume that this civilization was a fairly recent player in Mesoamerican history, and that they would have been contemporary with the classical Maya in the second half of the first millennium CE. It wasn't an unreasonable conclusion at the time. Remember, this was before carbon dating was being used in archaeology. Back then, the best way to date Mesoamerican civilizations was by stratigraphy, or even better, by cataloging the dates on their monument inscriptions. Sterling, however, suspected that this civilization was much older. Unfortunately for Sterling, he had no hard proof to back up his theories. That is until one day when he chanced upon an incredible discovery, a broken Olmec stela with a partial date inscription. Although the second half of the date inscription was missing, he and his wife Marion deduced that the date on the stela was September 3rd, 32 BCE. By far the oldest written date ever recorded in Mesoamerica. When this was published, it was hailed as a great... Oh wait, actually, no. It was immediately derided by their colleagues as the incredulous result of over-enthusiastic speculation. Everyone insisted that the Olmec civilization could not have been that old. Bummer. But not for long. As luck would have it, the Sterlings would be vindicated in the ensuing decades by carbon dating and later by the discovery of the rest of the stela by a local farmer, which allowed archaeologists to verify the Sterlings' proposed date. They had been right all along. This discovery stunned the academic world. It proved the true antiquity of the Olmec and showed that they were the first major civilization in Mesoamerica. Last episode, we examined the Norte Chico, one of the first civilizations of the Americas. In it, we discussed how the Peruvian coast was a cradle of American civilization, and how those pre-ceramic civilizations laid important foundations for later Andean cultures. But Peru was not the only cradle in the Americas. In Mesoamerica, there was another one, on the Mexican coast. So just like we did in our last episode, let's examine the origins of Mesoamerican civilization by exploring its first great civilization, the Olmec. Many aspects of Mesoamerican culture, such as calendars, ball games, and the Mesoamerican pantheon, can be traced back to Olmec influences. And these influences were tremendous. Before we can discuss the Maya, the Zapotec, the Toltecs, and the Aztecs, we need to examine the Olmec and their contributions to Mesoamerican civilization. Unfortunately, the Olmec left us no discernible written histories, nor any oral traditions. All that is known about the Olmec comes to us from archaeology or from the study of subsequent cultures. As much as we know about the Olmec, we are clueless about some basic facts, like the language they spoke or what they called themselves. In fact, the name Olmec comes from the word Olmen, a Nahuatl word meaning rubber people. Rubber was produced by the region's inhabitants as far back as Olmec times, all the way until European contact, hence the name. Just keep in mind that Olmec is the name retroactively applied to them by modern scholars. It's not a name that they would have used themselves. Before Olmec civilization arose, the people of Mesoamerica had only recently begun living a sedentary lifestyle. What made this shift possible was the domestication of crops like gourds, squash, beans, avocados, and chilies, but above all, corn, or as we ought to refer to it, maize. Maize was first domesticated in Mexico between 7000 BCE and 6500 BCE, and it would change everything as it was cultivated more and more intensively. So important was maize to the Mesoamericans that most cultures had a maize deity in some form. On an interesting side note, maize was originally domesticated from the Teosinte plant. It's a testament to their agricultural prowess that this tiny grass was fashioned into one of the most important staple crops in the world. I mean, just look how tiny those cobs are. If you aren't very impressed by maize, I'd also like to point out that the Olmec were the first civilization to have chocolate. Let's take a moment to thank the Olmecs for helping bestow chocolate on this cruel world, and let's get back to our topic. By the beginning of the second millennium BCE, civilization was beginning to take shape. What's fascinating about the development of Mesoamerican civilization is that it occurred very late compared to other early civilizations. But when it did, it blossomed with astonishing speed. Archaeologist Brian Fagan sums this up excellently.
A vast chasm separates the thousands of farming villages scattered throughout Central America in 2000 BC and the sophisticated civilizations that arose with dramatic suddenness only 1500 years later.
Nothing epitomizes that drastic change better than the rise of the Olmec. For over 1,000 years, from 1700 BCE to the end of the first millennium BC, the Olmec were a cultural juggernaut in Mesoamerica. Despite being largely confined to the Mexican Gulf Coast and the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, the Olmec exercised an oversized influence over Central America. Unlike their contemporaries, the Olmec were living in large, planned urban settlements with elite residences, workshops, and rich, elaborate tombs. The best known of these sites is the city of Laventa, which lies from 900 BCE to 400 BCE. Laventa has a planned layout with many temple mounds surrounding a main plaza. The main feature of the site is its Great Pyramid. It's been badly eroded in the millennia since its construction, but surveys and excavations show that it was a large rectangular pyramid with stepped sides, much like later pyramids in Mesoamerica. These are all features that we're going to see later in Mesoamerican cities. This wasn't just a city of corn farmers, although there were a lot of those. It was an economic and cultural hub, home to merchants, artists, sculptors, priests, and a ruling elite. Laventa is not an isolated example. Other Olmec cities have their own monuments. The fact that the Olmec elite could commission such huge public works speaks to the sophistication of Olmec society. But what exactly were they commissioning? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's take a look at Olmec art to find out. Nothing highlights the Olmec better than their distinctive and recognizable art. Their most iconic and well-known works are by far their colossal heads. Even if you've never studied the Olmec, you've probably seen pictures of them in a textbook or on TV. These heads are gigantic. Each one is carved from a huge block of basalt. The nearest source of this is all the way in the Untouched mountains, which means that they had to not only be carved, but moved huge distant seas. Remember, there are no draft animals in Mesoamerica. You can't just strap some oxen and mules to the boulders and tell them to move. They could only be moved by human labor. The organization and effort to move these from quarries to cities and ceremonial centers must have been enormous. As far as we know, they could have been dragged over land or perhaps transported on balsa rafts via local rivers like the Surf. But what are these sculptures exactly? Most scholars agree that these heads represent Roman forms. It's just one distinct and no two portray the same person. Each head has a helmet on the head. The heads are very recognizable for their wrinkles and their broad facial features, like the flag noses and foreheads. These striking features actually caused some to theorize that the heads are sculptural Africans. These terms are rejected by historians. I'll have more to say about this. In total, there's
Design perfect voice for your brand. Change the way you record voiceovers and branded content with the #1 AI-powered voice generating technology. Stop searching for the perfect voice and stop wasting time re-recording take after take. Try 11 Labs for free and start elevating your content today.
You always wondered why that hour didn't exist. Now you can make it. Meet Replit Agent. Want a custom workout plan? Make an app for that. Have a great idea at 2 a.m.? Make an app for that.
The British Empire came to accumulate a large amount of territories on the American continent in its time. Many of these
Belize has long been the exception, said Hamid.
Hello, everyone.
The good news from Belize is there's no news from Belize. Given that it's in Central America, that is...
I think it was Marcus Garvey once said that the people without a history is the people who were lost. Today we will talk history on Carib Nation, the history of Belize. So don't go anywhere, Carib Nation is up next. I'm David Hines here in Belize, and as I said in the beginning, today we're going to talk about the history of Belize, and we're going to be talking with a person who has a popular history in his head. And the couple of days that I've met him, I refer to him as the walking encyclopedia here in Belize. I'm talking about Emery King. Emery King. You go around Belize and you ask anyone about Emery King, and they say, yes, we know him. Mr. Emery King, welcome to Carib Nation.
Thank you very much.
Well, we want to talk today about the history of Belize, both social history and political and economic history. But I want to start off first of all by asking you, why should anyone care about the history of a country?
Well, all right, that's an excellent point. Let me tell you, Belize is a country with 6 races of people who speak among them 8 languages. And people come here from outside, tourists and visitors and potential investors, and they often ask, how did all these people get here? Well, if that question is of interest to them, it is far more of interest to the people who live here, who want to know, how did my father, grandfather, great-grandfather come to be in this place? 6 races of people who, by the way, are all getting along well together. We have no problems. There's no racial discrimination, no religious intolerance, no political violence. We've been doing this now for almost 300 years, and it's all worked out fine. It surprises many people who come. I came 50 years ago to Belize, and I've been studying the history of Belize ever since. How did all these different groups of people get here? And how is it that in many cases they were refugees from other wars going on in Mexico and Central America, and yet when they crossed the border, there was no longer any warfare, no killing, everybody seemed to get along fine.
What do you think it comes to that?
I think that two things. One is that this was a British place. We have British law. And across the borders in Latin America, you don't have that kind of law and order. The British brought law and order, and when people came over here, they realized they were going to get a fair shake, as it were. They did not get a fair shake where they came from, whether it was Central America or Mexico. We even had some ex-Confederates who came down here from Mississippi after the Civil War because they didn't want to be reconstructed by the Yankees. And we had people from Salvador out of that terrible war they had in Salvador in the 70s. We get Guatemalans, all kinds of people come here.
So your argument, therefore, is that the influence of the British, has that something to do with the relative calm that you experience here?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. As you, I am sure, know, these Central American countries' law is based on the old Spanish colonial laws, which were based on the Napoleonic law, which said, in effect, that if you're arrested, we assume that you're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. Well, you know, that's not the way it works in Belize or in America or London or Kingston, Jamaica. It's an entirely different philosophy of government, different philosophy of law, and of social justice.
Take us back to, of course, the first people were the indigenous people.
The Mayas.
The Mayas. Take us there, and what happened?
Well, the Mayas were doing very well up until about, well, let me see, 1,000, 1,500 years ago, when they had some serious problems. They'd been doing very, very well for 1,000 years. Built all these wonderful cities that you see in Guatemala and Honduras and Mexico and Belize.
Famous for mathematics.
But they got into trouble in many ways the same way that the world is getting in trouble. Overpopulation, environmental degradation, and overburden of government. Too much taxes. You had to support an ever-growing bureaucracy and military establishment. And eventually somebody said, I don't need this. I don't have to keep planting more and more corn in order to give to the king to support the army and all those civil servants. And therefore, I'm going to take my family and move off 50 miles and just leave these people. And little by little, everybody moved away, and the whole structure collapsed. The people quit building buildings. The aristocracy didn't know how to plant corn. They never had to. And little by little, the Mayas went back to basics, as it were. And this was long before the Spanish conquest.
And now come to, right. And of course, let's fast forward now and come to the Spanish conquest, the beginning of colonialism, as it were.
In Mexico, it started in Mexico with Cortez in 1519. However, in 1511, 8 years before Cortez, a Spanish soldier washed up on the shores of Mexico out of a shipwreck and was enslaved by the Mayas and sent to what is now Belize, and wound up marrying a Maya lady and having children, and therefore became the father of the first mestizos in Central America. That was in 1511, 12, 13. In 1519, Cortez showed up, and they told him that there's a fellow that looks like you down there in the south, and he said, send for him. And the man's name was Gonzalo Guerrero, and he refused to come. Sent back word that he was a married man, and he had children, and he was an important fellow in his village, and he didn't want to go. So he stayed. And 11 years later, he fought off, along with the Mayans, he fought off the Spanish army that came to take over and would have taken over what is now Belize. But they were beaten so badly that the Spaniards in Mexico built a fort on the other side of the Hondo River, and they didn't send anybody down here for 150 years, except some missionaries, and they were chased out by the Mayans. Then, in 1670, the first British European came. He was a Scottish pirate named Captain Peter Wallace. Shipwrecks out here. There's a lot of shipwrecks in the history of Belize. And this Captain Wallace discovered logwood growing up in these swamps, which fetched a large price in Europe. So he started cutting logwood and also harassing Spanish shipping. He didn't quit being a pirate, and he pretty soon had a fleet of pirate boats working with him. The Spanish had discovered gold up in what is now Tegucigalpa in Honduras, and every time they tried to send gold to Havana, Captain Wallace would come out. And in 1722, mahogany became king. Everybody in Europe, because of Chippendale and Heffelwhite and the British cabinet makers in the American colonies and in London, wanted mahogany. It was a beautiful wood, it was easy to work, and the best mahogany in the world grew in what is now Belize. That meant we had to import slaves. There was never a slave market in Belize. No ship ever came here with slaves to sell. Whenever the people who lived here needed help, they would go to Jamaica and bring back 3 or 4 people at a time. That way we built it up. Most of those people were Jamaicans. They had not even been born in Africa. Then, who came next? Well, from the Garifuna in 1802.
Let's talk about the Garifuna. They came from St. Vincent.
They were down, what happened is they were a whole new race of people. Before Columbus came, there was no such thing as Garifuna in the world. What had happened was that there was a rather hostile group of Amerindians living up the Orinoco River in Venezuela. And hundreds of years before Columbus, these people had come up the Orinoco and crossed the Lake Maracaibo and got out into the sea, which was later named for them, the Caribbean Sea. They were called by the English historians, they were called Red Caribs. After Columbus came, slavery was introduced in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other places. Runaway slaves, escaped slaves found their way out of the island on rafts and little boats and logs and however they could get, and the southern drift of the current took them to St. Vincent, where they met the Red Caribs. The Red Caribs and the escaped, runaway, and shipwrecked slaves mated with the Red Caribs and created a whole new race of people called the Black Caribs, according to the English historians. They called themselves Garifuna. And the French first tried to take over the island, and they were beaten off. Then the British tried to take the island in what was called the First Carib War, and they were beaten off. But by 1796, the Second Carib War came, the British sent more troops and more ships and more of everything, and they defeated the poor people down there, and then they didn't know what to do with it. Well, we got 5,000 men, women, and children here, and they were unwilling to enslave them and send them to their colonies in the Caribbean, because these are pretty tough birds, and they're going to create trouble. Well, they were equally unwilling to line them up with children, so they decided to send them to Belize. Well, for reasons which are unclear, they never got here. They were dumped on the island of Roatan down in what is now Honduras in 1797. And it's a little island, has no water, has nothing on it but coconut trees. They were in serious shape in several days, a few days. There was no water, no food. But the Spanish came over from Trujillo on the mainland and said, we will accept you on the mainland of Honduras under two conditions. One is that you swear allegiance to the King of Spain, and the second is that you become Roman Catholic. Well, you know, these people were starving, and
So they said yes.
Amen, let's go. And they went over there. Well, that was in 1797. By 1802, 150 Garifuna came to what is now Belize, established a village down in the south, which they call Red Cliff, and which we call Barranco, the last village before you get to the Sarstoon River, our border with Guatemala. In 1823, 2,000 Garifuna came running away from real trouble in Honduras. Honduras had become independent of Spain in 1821, and by 1823 they were killing each other over politics. And the Garifuna apparently had backed the wrong horse in an election or something, and they had to run. And they came here. And trouble right away. Some of the magistrates said, no, we don't, those are fierce people. They may be cannibals. We don't know what they're going to kill us in our bed, you know. And others said not a bit of it. There's 150 of them down in Barranco, and I've hired them, and they work all right, and they're peaceful people. So they made a compromise and said, all right, they can come, but they can't come north of the Stan Creek River. So the Garifuna established what is now Dangriga and St. Bob and Punta Gorda. And later on a new village they called Newtown, and then is now called Hopkins. They have become excellent, excellent citizens of this country.
Mm-hmm. That's you're talking about dogwood and mahogany and so on and so forth. During the period of colonialism, what other crops were produced here in Belize?
Practically none. We were not an agricultural or a plantation economy. We stuck with cutting down wood. If there were a little garden patch behind the house, that's all right. But as far as making any crops for export, never happened.
That was sugar introduced.
Well, hardly introduced by the mestizos who came from Yucatan and from 1847 to 1912 up north. We did ship some sugar in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, but it was nothing. It was really nothing. One of our businessmen imported an old obsolete sugar mill from Cuba in 1931, and it was pretty well beat up by that time, and by the time we got around to the 50s, it was finished. And some Jamaican people came in, the Sharp family from Trout Hall, Jamaica, they had planted oranges down in Dangriga in the Stan Creek Valley, and they started to redo the sugar industry, and it was going along, and they sold it to Tate and Lyle in the 60s, who built a whole new sugar factory in Orange Walk. And our leader, who later became the father of our country, George Price, the Right Honorable George Price, convinced Tate and Lyle that they didn't want to raise sugar cane, they wanted to make sugar. Therefore, they should take these thousands of acres of land and sell them to the sugar planters in the north. Every little village should have their own sugar plantation, not the villages, but the individual people, so that we have several thousand individual cane growers now. And the whole industry is, and Tate and Lyle is finally sold out, and the cane farmers now own the factory as well as the fields. Unfortunately, world trade being what it is, sugar is in serious trouble and prices are going down. We're beginning to diversify into papayas and bell peppers and okra and one thing and another.
Belize became independent
1981.
1981. But the whole process of decolonization, the struggle for decolonization, actually began 1950. Talk a little bit about the anti-colonial struggle here in Belize.
Yes, what we call the movement of liberation.
Yes.
Started in 1950. What happened was, after World War II, a number of the people who had gone away to the war, either as military people or as laborers, came home from Panama, where they had worked in the canal zone, from various places in the United States where they had been in agricultural industries or in industrial development, and some from the UK who had been in the military. And they came back home with new ideas. And one of the ideas that they had was that a man doesn't have to work and work and work and save and save and save in order to buy a stove. That you could get credit in places like America, where a man can buy a bed and a chair and a table and pay for it over time. And that started the credit union movement in Belize, which spread rapidly and very, very successfully to this day. So that poor people can go and borrow $25 or $50, and then these days they're borrowing $25,000. The second idea that came out of that was that we don't really need to be a colony. We don't really need to sit here and wait for Mother England to say, well, okay, I think we can afford to build a building, or we can afford to pave a road. We don't need that. We can make our own decisions. And that started the movement of liberation, which was not a very popular idea among certain people, as it was everywhere. There's always people who said no. But George Price was one of the leaders at the beginning, and a brilliant man, and a compassionate man. He spent a great deal of time seeing to it that there would be no violence, no riots, no bloodshed to mar our march to independence. And that took 31 years, from 1950 to 1981. But
Self-government came in
64. We balanced the budget, we got out of treasury control in England, and we became an internal self-government. The governor now, the British governor, only had the portfolios, as it were, of foreign affairs and defense. Everything else was in the hands of elected officials in Belize.
Today, Belize is identified both as a Caribbean country on account of culture and language, but it's also part of the continent of Central America.
We're geographically in Central America, and more people are coming in from Central America because our standard of living is greater than Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico. They come here seeking jobs, which pay much more here than they do back in their country. That has, like everything, is a two-edged sword. Sometimes it cuts for you and sometimes it cuts against you. We are bringing in a lot of people who do not speak English, who grew up with the idea that the policeman is an enemy, the soldier is an enemy, the politician, the judge, these are all enemies. And if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you don't go to court, you settle it with a machete or a revolver. And we've got to turn these people into good Belizeans. They need to learn English. They need to learn the kind of constitution and government and our philosophy of living together. It's a monumental job.
Many of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, in Central Latin America, indeed in many parts of the Third World, became embroiled in the conflicts of the Cold War. Countries became ideologically polarized. Belize apparently did not become so much embroiled.
No, we did not.
Why not?
George Price said it was an alien ideology and had no business in Belize.
Which one?
Communism. Socialism.
Yeah.
There were some very brilliant young men who came back educated from university with that idea. But the general public didn't go for it. And George Price said, no, this is not what Belize is all about. And, those folks are still with us, you know, but it's not militancy, and we don't, nothing much is happening.
Is there any militancy on the other side?
No.
Would you say that capitalism is taking roots in Belize in any serious way?
Mercantilism.
Okay.
Mercantilism.
Mhm.
And now tourism is coming along to create a lot of jobs for ordinary people.
Yeah, but let's talk a little bit about tourism, because yes, it does create a lot of jobs for ordinary people, but it brings with it what I call some baggage. How is Belize dealing with that?